Good morning and greetings in Jesus' name this morning. Just maybe before I get started, we did have a round of the flu at our house, so that's why Thelma and some of the girls aren't here, and I had it yesterday, but thankfully it's a 24-hour thing, so I feel a lot better today. I'm not sure how long I'll stay afterwards, just in case I am passing something around. I don't want to do that either, so I think I'm mostly over it. This morning, I guess will be sort of a test run for Winder Bible School topic that I'm giving at a number of different churches, and it is one that I think somebody else is planning to give at Lichty, so it's the same topic, but I'm pretty sure that this topic is wide enough that whatever he brings will be different than what I'm bringing, or have enough difference that you don't need to feel like you don't need to go to that one or anything. It's not going to be that much the same likely. The topic was basically lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, found in 2 Timothy 3. And that's the text for this morning that we're going to look at. When I started thinking about this topic, one of the things that came to my mind was the Pilgrim's Progress. When Christian and faithful were traveling on their journey to the celestial city, they got to a place in that book, in his dream as it was in the book, called Vanity Fair. And it says, I'll just read what it says there, that when they got out of the wilderness, they presently saw a town before them. The name of that town was Vanity, and a fair was held there all year long. The road to the celestial city was through the midst of the town and the great fair, and so the two pilgrims must needs go that way. As they walked, they saw the places, rows, and streets where all sorts of things were bought and sold. One street was called the English Row, another the French Row, another the Italian Row, another the German Row. And as the pilgrims went quietly along, intent upon their own duty, they were beset by a number of hawkers and barkers, urging them to buy of their goods. "What will you buy? What will you buy?" they cried, and they offered all sorts of vanities and follies. The people who visited this fair and who spent most of their time there were pressed in richly and gaudy apparel, and they seemed to have nothing to do but to eat, drink, and be merry. Now, as I said, the way to the celestial city lies through this town, where the lusty fair is kept, and he that will go to the city, the celestial city, and yet not go through this town, must needs go out of the world. And I thought that was kind of an interesting picture of us as Christians going to the celestial city, but we must go through Vanity Fair, and we're surrounded by that in our culture today. The people, it said, that spent most of their time there were dressed in rich and gaudy apparel and seemed to have nothing to do but to eat, drink, and be merry. And it feels like that's the culture that we're living in today. 2 Timothy 3, reading verses 1 through 7. "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with divers lusts, ever learning and never able to come to knowledge of the truth." So we have this warning here in 2 Timothy, like Christian and faithful traveling on their journey to the celestial city. Each of us is on a journey too, that same Christian journey. And when we're traveling, sometimes people ask the question, is your trip for business or pleasure? And I think when we answer that, we often know if it's one or the other as we're going on a trip. But as we travel through the journey of life, I think that should maybe be a constant question that we are asking of ourselves. What is my purpose as I go through life? Is my purpose pleasure, or is it work, the work of the kingdom? And I think that just because we say it is the work of the kingdom does not mean that it's without pleasure either, because there is, as we'll look at later, there's pleasure in the work of God. So to look at this subject in this text a little bit more, the first thing that might come to our mind when we look at this is it says that in the last days. And so to understand this, where we are in relation to this, I think it's important that we look at who this was meant to be talked about. and who he was talking about as he talked about this. Because if we don't understand that, it's easy then for us to push it to some other time or period in history and say, well, this verse really doesn't apply to us in our time here. So when Paul says that in the last days perilous times shall come, when is this happening? Are the last days past? Are they present? Or are they future? And was Paul telling Timothy that in the future, unsaved people are going to become worse and become lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God just sometime in the future? Well, we already know that the people in the New Testament times had these characteristics already. We know from many other verses in the New Testament that there was lots of people who had those characteristics in the time that this was written. So was Paul just letting Timothy know that thousands of years from now, unsaved people are going to be worse than they are today? Is that what this is all about? Just a warning about sometime in the future? Well, I don't think that's what this is talking about either, because this is a pastoral epistle or a book of the Bible, and Paul was providing Timothy with instructions on how to be a pastor. And he was talking to him about these people that he was going to be faced with, lovers of pleasure. And he even says he sort of grounds it there now in verse 8, now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses. He even goes back into history and says these kind of people were already existing before this was written in this New Testament era. So I think that when you look at this, you can see that these last days are not a period of time at the end of history, but they're relevant for all times, that we could think of it more as an age rather than just a specific slot in history. They were applicable to Timothy, and they're also applicable to any Christian living in the New Testament era between when Christ came and the second coming. So whether it's 50 AD or 2026 or 2226, these verses apply to us as Christians, as long as Christ has not returned. There is other, in Hebrews 1:2, it does say, in these last days. And so while this one says, this know ye that in the last days, that word is also used in the present tense as well, that they talked about in the Hebrews there as in these last days God has spoken to us by his Son. So therefore, Paul is describing here a present and ongoing reality for the church. Not some future catastrophe, but something that we all face in our time as long as we're here on earth before the second coming. One question we could ask too, it says that perilous times shall come. It does seem from other instances that there's a sense that these things are getting worse. As history goes along, that these tendencies and these evil characteristics here, and especially looking at the one that we're thinking about, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, that there's more and more of that happening. And just looking at history a little bit, it does seem to be that that's somewhat the case. Looking at American history even, the ideals of 150 years ago in the United States were quite different than the ideals about the subject of pleasure than they are today. There was much more a sense that pleasure, just living for pleasure and for self and for sensuous things, was something that was bad, was kind of universally held as something not good, as a sign of some reading about it said they decried excessive wealth as crass, materialistic, and morally corrosive. And just one little instance, I was listening to a book about the Johnstown flood, and I thought it was kind of interesting. There was a hunting and fishing club on the lake above the dam there that broke, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. And these were a lot of wealthy businessmen from Pittsburgh who got rich in the steel business. And they had some private cabins around this South Fork Dam. And they didn't let the local people come up and fish there and things. And they got a lot of negative publicity because of this. They felt like these rich people were just sitting up on this lake and kind of hogging it all for themselves. And I think if you would look at the cabins that they had there, and they were basically just doing hunting and fishing on the lake, we would pretty much say that's how the average person here in the United States lives nowadays. But back 150 years ago, that was seen as these people were kind of living at a level that was unnecessary, and they kind of blamed them for not taking care of the dam. And it seemed, as I was listening to that, like there is a difference in how people look at pleasure today than they did even 150 years ago in the United States. The other thing that pleasure-seeking was often tied, just reading what it said here, pleasure-seeking was tied to fears of decadence, some viewing hedonism as un-American or effeminizing. And so I think if you look at history, there's no doubt that this is something that seems to be increasing, that there's a much greater tolerance for open pursuit of pleasure than there would have been even 100 or 200 years ago in the United States. And I think you can also observe that in our communities too. If we're honest, in a much shorter amount of time, our capacity or our amount of time that we spend pursuing things of pleasure are probably quite a bit more than they were even 50 years ago. You think about how many cabins there are now versus 40 years ago, how many people spend much more time doing that, more than they did probably 50 years ago, how much time is spent on sports, even in our high schools. There's lots of different things where we can say, yes, it's very, very, without a doubt, we spend more time pursuing pleasure as Mennonites than we did even 50 years ago. And again, I'm not saying all that is wrong, but I think it's something that we need to look at honestly and consider where we fit into this subject of lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Pleasure seeking is often seen as a sign of decline too, that when a culture begins to move more and more into seeking pleasure, it's often a sign of its decline, that it's at the end of its time. We have the example in the Bible of the rich fool, who again, he said, well, now it's my time to eat, drink, and be merry, and then his soul was required of him, and again, said, what use is all those things then at that time? Think about the Roman Empire, the bread and circuses at the end of the Roman Empire, and even looking at the United States, the late American Empire. I think you could say the same thing about that as well, that as people more and more, a whole culture begins to pursue pleasure seeking, it's a sign that things are going downhill, that it's not good for a country to be like that. So another question we could look at here is, who was this being written about? Was it only to the pagans that were living around Timothy at this time? Is that who this was written to? This list of attributes here shows that people that were extremely self-centered and morally corrupt, people who are lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, and all those other things kind of lead up to that, all those other attributes. They certainly don't sound like Christians in any way, but how much value is it to make this point that sinful people are very sinful? Well, if you're sinful, you probably will have a lot of these characteristics, but was there something else that Paul was saying here and who he was talking to? It seems like Paul was warning Timothy about something that was more dangerous than the people outside that were sinful. And you look at what the last description there says in verse 5, having a form of godliness, that it was talking about people, not all people that were out there, but people that were also inside the church. Was this list of people that he was talking about, it was directed at them as well. They had a form of godliness, but underneath they loved themselves more than they loved God. And I had to think about Luke 8:14, where Jesus talks about the parable of the sower. It says, now the ones that fell among the thorns are those who, when they have heard, go out and are choked with cares, riches, and pleasures of life, and bring no fruit to maturity. And I think that parable kind of brings out that idea of that there were people that were saved for a time, but then they fell away when the cares of the world came into their lives and it left them choke it out. They had started out on the right path, but slowly lost their way and loved themselves more than they loved God. And can these people still be in the church? Well, unfortunately, I think that is possible. And I think the answer to that is yes, that this is not just talking about people outside the church, but people that are inside the church as well. And again, not right with God if this is the attributes that apply to them, but may still be among us as well. So we know that lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God applies directly to us, both in time and in place, that he was talking to people in our present time and he was talking to us as Christians as well. And I think then the question we need to ask is, how does this happen? How do people become lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God? Maybe one question we should look at first, though, is what is pleasure, just to define it. Dictionary definition says the gratification of the senses or of the mind, agreeable sensations or emotions, the excitement, relish, or happiness produced by the expectation or the enjoyment of something good, delightful, or satisfying, opposed to pain or sorrow, etc. And so that's the dictionary definition of pleasure. But in 2 Timothy here, lovers of pleasure and lovers of God are two different Greek words. And they're basically talking about two different types of people, a type of person. The lover of pleasure, and there's a Greek word for that, I won't try to pronounce it, but the term refers to a pleasure-loving or hedonistic person who is given over to the pursuit of earthly pleasures through the five senses. And if you're familiar with the term hedonist or hedonism, it's the idea that pleasure in the senses of the satisfaction of desires is the highest good and proper aim of human life. And so it's kind of a philosophy or a way of living. People talk about hedonism as that idea that all that matters is to do what feels good, basically. And usually that's paired with the idea that there's nothing in the end anyway, so what does it matter? Just live life and get the most you can out of it, have the most fun and get the most pleasure out of life. And then the lover of God is also a type of individual, but it's a type of individual who has a deep affection for God, pursues him, and strives to obey him daily. And so you have the lovers of pleasure and the lovers of God, two different types of personalities, and they're contrasted here with each other. Throughout the Bible, you also have the pleasure sort of portrayed both negatively and positively. So you look at Psalm 16:11, it says, that verse, "Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore." And so pleasures are something that are also given in a positive light. And then we have our verse today here in 2 Timothy. And also Titus 3:3, it says, "For we ourselves were also sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving divers lusts and pleasures, living in malice, envy, hateful, and hating one another." And so then we also have it often portrayed negatively too, when it's talked about in these lists of sins or in other ways as well. So one question again is, does Christianity have a problem with pleasure? And who is the creator of pleasure? Who was the creator of that? So for the rest of the sermon here, I'd like to consider the how of pleasure. How can we make sure that we keep pleasure in its proper perspective as Christians, so that we don't become lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God? We can probably all relate at different times in our life to pursuing wrong or questionable pleasures. That's something we can all relate to. I don't think I need to say that as a question, because no matter what your situation is, we have all at some point chased wrong or questionable pleasures, and we found out that it didn't satisfy us, it didn't fulfill us. The new experience that we thought would bring satisfaction, or the new toy, or the new whatever substance, only ended up with us feeling guilty or addicted, or just like that just wasn't what I thought it was going to be, kind of unfulfilled. And we live in a culture that's always telling us that, you can just do it, get what you can, get it all. But even when we do that, we often feel like something is missing. There's that sense that pursuing pleasure is not providing the thing that I'm hoping that it will provide. And that's one side of pleasure, is that the earthly way of pursuing it. On the other side is the idea that pleasure itself is the enemy. And so there's that one extreme of going out and doing things, that's finding pleasure and then finding it's not fulfillment. There's the other side of it, the people that say that all pleasure is wrong, that real faith means saying no to fun, and anything that provides pleasure is a question, and that it's wrong most likely, which kind of turns life into a boring drudgery if that's what we think that faith is. And that doesn't feel right either. So there's kind of this tension between where is the middle ground for pleasure for the Christian. We know it's not just giving ourselves over to pleasure, but we also know that there is a sense that God wants us to be fulfilled, and he says there's pleasures at his right hand forevermore, and that Jesus said that he gave us life to live abundantly, not as though we need to be people that are just making sure that we don't have any fun or any pleasure in our life. So if we go back to the beginning, and I don't have to turn to this, I don't think, Genesis 3, we know this is where the problem started at, back with Adam and Eve in the garden. And that fruit, that pleasure that they had at that point, it looked very promising. It looked very good. The story that was told about what would happen if Eve took the fruit also sounded really good too, very promising. And Adam and Eve decided to just do it. They went and they took the fruit, and we know what happened. Instantly after they took it, they felt shame, they hid from God, and they were separated from God. And I think that's the pattern that pursuing pleasure has continued on all through history, is that same pattern of being wrongly tempted, being convinced of something, tempted by something, and then taking of it, and then instantly finding out, or very shortly afterwards, that it was not what we thought it would be. Just pursuing those gifts apart from the Creator or the giver. And we also have the example of Solomon, who tried everything. It says that he tried wealth, he tried women, he tried work, he tried wine, and all kinds of entertainment. And his verdict was that it's all vanity, a striving after the wind, complete worthlessness. And so we have those two common examples in the Bible. Probably when you think about pursuing pleasure, that's one of the first things we think about is Solomon and Ecclesiastes. So where does pleasure fit into the Christian life? And I think that if you look back at Genesis before Genesis 3, you get an idea what God intended for the world. So in the Garden of Eden, you had a place that was full of pleasure, the right kind of pleasure. There was total fulfillment in nature, and I think in their work at that point. The work was not drudgery. It only became drudgery and the sweat of their brow after sin entered into it. There was all these things that it was just a perfect environment and a place of pleasure. And I think we can say that when we look at that. And so pleasure isn't the problem. It's really a gift. And again, that verse in Psalm 16:11 would point to that. 1 Timothy 6:17 said, God richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Again, the idea that God is giving to us. He's not trying to hold things back from us, but he's giving us joy. And there will be adversities and things like that, but a true Christian is going to be able to find joy and pleasure in living out the Christian life. So the ultimate source of pleasure isn't out there in creation. I think that's where we often go astray, is we go looking for it in creation rather than in the Creator. And that's where true pleasure is really found. And our hunger for pleasure that we pursue by going to creation and looking for it in all kinds of things and substances and experiences is just a misplaced hunger for God. That there's an emptiness there that this pleasure that we're seeking is trying to fill, and that can only be filled by God. Jesus didn't come to strip away joy. He said in John 10:10, I am come that they may have life and that they might have it more abundantly. And again, that idea of Jesus coming so that we can have life and live it to the most is a very important part of this. And so as long as we're living as Christians should, in turning our life over to Jesus and living after him, then all these desires that we have can be redeemed. But often if they're not redeemed, they're going to lead us down these paths of pleasure and become lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Godly pleasure has some characteristics that make it different than worldly pleasures, and I just like to think about that here towards the end here. Number one is they do not leave a bad aftertaste. And I think that you all know what a bad aftertaste is. Some people, when they drink diet soda, they get that. Different kinds of food, you get it, whatever. You kind of get this taste in the back of your mouth like that. That was okay when it went in, but now it's just not leaving a good taste in my mouth. Well, godly pleasures don't leave a bad aftertaste, and earthly pleasures do. They leave feelings of guilt and long-term emptiness and regret, whether it's hangovers, long-lasting addictions, diseases, more stress, whatever. That's the aftertaste of earthly pleasure. It's not something that fills up and satisfies. It leaves a bad taste as we look back at it. Godly pleasure, on the other hand, is something you can look back on with joy instead of with regret. When we can look back at experiences where, yes, we had a good time, where we had fun, where we had meaningful experiences, and look back on those things with fondness or with joy rather than with regret, because they were in that area of loving God rather than loving pleasure. Godly pleasures provide rest and refreshment, true rest and refreshment. And it's often the simple things that give us godly pleasure. Some of you might know I enjoy coffee. So to me, I enjoy having a cup of coffee in the morning and getting a good roast and just tasting those flavors, the notes and everything in it. It might be a little hoity-toity. Some of you can relate, some of you can't. But I have to think about how you can get a $30 French press or a pour-over machine and you can make really good coffee. Or you can go spend $1,000 on an espresso machine and you can make good espresso too. But is the enjoyment really that much greater than the $30 French press? It's more about just sometimes learning to appreciate things in the moment. And I think food and some of those things are just natural things that we can enjoy and God has given for us to enjoy, as long as they're kept in moderation. Vacations are another area where I think you can see this. People spend thousands and thousands of dollars to go on cruises and go to exotic, resorts and things like that and be pampered and entertained. And they get away for a short while, but when they get back, they find that all the things that they were trying to get away from are still there. So if your life is the problem, getting away for a little bit is not going to fix the problem, no matter how much money you spend. And I think that, thinking about how Christians find pleasure in recreation or in taking a vacation is different than how the world finds pleasure in that. Our vacations can be built around visiting people and finding, just resting, rather spending time alone with God, getting away, just having time to do that, not all kinds of extra luxuries and entertainments, which is what the world thinks of when they think of taking a vacation. Number 3, and these are just kind of random thoughts I had as I was thinking about this, they reflect God's goodness. Food is something that not only provides energy for our physical needs, but can provide pleasure as well. And so God has given us, and he made it that way, that he could have made food all just, a bar that we ate. And maybe manna was a little bit like that. At first the manna tasted really good, but after they ate it the same thing for 40 years, the children of Israel got tired of it. But food comes in many different flavors, many different textures and all kinds of things, and it provides enjoyment to us. And again, there's always moderation where you can spend too much time on food, too much money and things like that. But God doesn't just meet our needs, but also brings pleasure in the process. And so again, all these things, when they're in their right perspective, are good for Christians and can be enjoyed. Another thing could be music. The right kind of music is worshipful to God. It's a form of worship, and it's also pleasurable to those performing the music and those listening to it. And so again, God provided music so that we can both worship him with it and receive pleasure and enjoyment through it at the same time. Nature is another thing that we can, if we just go out and spend time in nature or visit some of the amazing parks, whatever, we can be pointed to God's awesomeness, I think, in those areas as well. Again, there's all kinds of entertainment you can do, but sometimes just going out in nature and seeing that can be also a great thing and points to to his awesomeness in making creation. Another point is that godly pleasures do not promote the other sinful attributes here of 2 Timothy 3. And so the first two are lovers of self and lovers of money. The way that starts out talks about, know that in the last times, perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves and covetous, and most other translations say lovers of money. Godly pleasure is shared, and it does not require large amounts of money for it to be a godly pleasure. As a matter of fact, it's probably often once you have to spend a lot of money doing it, you're probably heading towards the lovers of pleasure more than the lovers of God. And I think that if somebody has been blessed or maybe cursed with large amounts of money, it does not mean that I am then allowed to spend a lot more on pleasure for myself than anybody else. I think that's a flat bar, and sometimes people think that, well, if I have lots of money, then that somehow entitles me as a Christian to larger doses of pleasure than other people. Well, I don't think that's what that means. But the thing is, if you have lots of money, you will be tempted to do that. And that is one of the curses of having a lot of money and a lot of riches, is that you will be tempted to spend a lot more and to do a lot more than people that just don't have the option. And so I think it's important, since most of us have a lot of money, that we always keep that in the back of our mind. Is what I'm doing really making me happier just because I'm spending a lot more money doing it? Or could I find fulfillment in something much more simpler that would not take so many resources? In conclusion, one story I read about, a pastor who talked about how much he enjoyed moving. He lived in Arizona. He talked about an experience he had where he moved into a house where it was in the bathroom, there was a double vanity there. And on his side of the vanity, the floor was heated. And he would get up in the cold mornings and go over there, because Arizona does get somewhat cold in the winter. And he enjoyed this heated floor. He didn't even know it had a heated floor. And he did think it was a little strange that it was only on his side of the two-person sink. His wife's side wasn't heated. And he thought he got a little bit of wrong pleasure from that too. And then it went on, and he enjoyed this. And I think that that's often a little bit how pleasure works, is that when something is pleasurable, our natural inclination is to kind of not overthink it too much, to just kind of enjoy it and take the story that's given or the temptation as it is. And we let our guard down and maybe accept things that we should be asking questions about. Well, one morning he stepped out into the hallway and he stepped into water. And he said, that's not good. The floor was completely soaked with water. He walked into the bathroom and saw that's where the water was coming from. And about that time, he realized that his his heated floor was actually a slow hot water leak that had now ruptured and had come up through the floor, flooded his house, and he had to rip all the tiles out of the bathroom, go down into the concrete to find the pipe and fix it. And thousands of dollars later, he said that little short-term pleasure of the hot water leak there, that he got the warm floor, was in no way equal to the pain that it caused later. And I think that's just a very small example of how earthly pleasure works rather than godly pleasure. Godly pleasure fulfills not just in the moment, but long after it too. And it satisfies while earthly pleasures leave us empty and in the end provide us nothing and will lead us to destruction. I was reading a verse that stood out to me, John 2:17, and his disciples remembered what it was written, the zeal of thine house has eaten me up. And just in his closing thought, I had to think about, they said that about Jesus, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. What will people remember about us when we are gone? Will they remember that the zeal of thy house hath eaten me up? In other words, that our zeal as lovers of God are what people will remember, or that we were lovers of pleasure. And I think that's the thought I'd like to leave us with as we think about this subject of lovers of God or lovers of pleasure. This time, why don't we kneel for a word of prayer?